deep in the remote mountains of Montana, a woman who had lost everything bought a forgotten cabin for $200. Fired from her job and evicted from her apartment, she sought only a place to disappear. But the townspeople watched her with pity and fear, refusing to speak of the property's history. While tearing out the rotted floorboards in the cellar, her hands brushed against something that made her blood run cold. A sealed iron hatch, hidden for decades, its surface covered in fresh scratches. Someone had tried to open it recently and failed. She didn't know that this discovery would put her life in danger, that powerful people had spent 15 years ensuring this secret stayed buried. What lay beneath that rusted door? Why had an entire town let this place rot rather than claim it? And who was already watching from the shadows? The air in the Flathead County Courthouse Annex hung thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and the faint bitterness of stale coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. It was the smell of forgotten things, of lives reduced to line items on a government ledger. And for Sarah Mitchell, it was the smell of her last, desperate chance. She sat on a hard wooden bench near the back of the room, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. In her jacket pocket was an envelope containing $800 in cash, and the sum total of everything she had left in the world after 3 months of cascading disasters. At 34 years old, Sarah was a woman who had once moved through life with confidence and purpose. She had been a senior accountant at a respected firm in Seattle, a professional who understood the language of numbers, who could find order in the most chaotic spreadsheets and sense in the most tangled financial records. Her apartment had been small but comfortable, filled with books and photographs, and the quiet evidence of a life built through years of careful, methodical work. Then the firm announced restructuring, a polite corporate term for the elimination of her entire department. The severance package lasted 2 months. The job market, despite her experience, proved impenetrable. The savings account dwindled, then emptied. The landlord's patience ran out, and the eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, its cold legal language a final punctuation mark on everything she had built. She sold what she could, gave away what she couldn't, and drove east with no destination in mind, only a vague, desperate notion that perhaps somewhere in the vast empty spaces of Montana she might find a place to simply exist while she figured out what came next. It was a classified listing in a small-town newspaper that led her here, to this room filled with farmers in worn overalls and speculators in pressed shirts, all of them gathered to pig over the carcasses of foreclosed properties and seized assets. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a red face and a voice that droned like a tired engine, worked through the list with mechanical efficiency. A truck sold for $3,000. A set of farm equipment went for $1,200. A small house on the edge of town sparked a brief bidding war before settling at $45,000. Sarah waited, watching, her heart beating a little faster each time a new lot was announced. Then the auctioneer paused, adjusting his glasses, and something shifted in the room, a subtle change in the atmosphere that Sarah felt before she understood it. "Next item," he said, his voice flattening. "Parcel 7B, known locally as the Vance property, up on Miller's Ridge. 120 acres, single cabin, condition listed as poor, access road unmaintained. Property comes to the county through tax delinquency, 15 years of unpaid taxes. We'll open the bidding at $200. 15 years. The number seemed to echo in the stale air. Sarah raised her hand. 200, she said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. The auctioneer's eyes found her, and she saw something flicker across his face, surprise, perhaps, or something closer to concern. "I have 200 from the woman in the back," he announced. "Do I hear 250? Silence. It was not the competitive silence of earlier lots, the tense pause before someone jumped in with a higher bid. This was different, heavier, almost suffocating. Sarah looked around the room and found the other attendees staring at her, with expressions she couldn't quite read. Pity, perhaps. Fear, Warning. Going once, the auctioneer said quickly, as if eager to be done with it. Going twice. Sold for $200. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. As Sarah walked to the front to sign the papers, she passed an elderly woman in a hand-knitted sweater who reached out and touched her arm. "That place has been nothing but trouble for 15 years, the woman whispered, her voice thin and urgent. "Some doors are better left closed, dear." Sarah nodded politely and continued forward, but the woman's words followed her like a cold draught. The clerk who processed her payment, a young man with nervous eyes, refused to meet her gaze as he pushed the deed across the counter. His hands, she noticed, were trembling. She had just bought a piece of Montana wilderness for the price of a week's groceries, and not a single soul had tried to stop her. As she stepped out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon light, the deed folded carefully in her pocket. She couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't purchased a property at all. She had purchased a warning that everyone else had been wise enough to heed. The sign above the store read, "Peterson's General Goods," in faded green letters, its paint peeling from decades of harsh mountain winters. Sarah pushed through the door, a small bell chiming overhead, and stepped into a space that smelled of sawdust, leather, and ground coffee beans. Shelves lined every wall, packed with canned foods, hardware supplies, and hunting gear. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face a weathered map of lines that spoke of hard times and long-kept secrets. Her eyes, pale but sharp, studied Sarah with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being examined under a microscope. Sarah gathered what she needed: a flashlight, batteries, matches, canned soup, coffee, and a heavy-duty padlock. She brought her items to the counter, and the woman began ringing them up with slow, deliberate movements. "You're the one who bought the Vance place," the woman said, and it was not a question. Sarah nodded, unsurprised that news travelled fast in a town this small. "I'm Margaret Peterson," the woman continued. "I've owned this store for 43 years, and I've learned to read faces. Yours tells me you don't know what you've walked into." She set down the can she was holding and fixed Sarah with a grave stare. "That property belonged to a woman named Elena Vance. She was an environmental scientist who used that cabin as a base for her research, studying the water systems in this valley, the streams and aquifers that folks depend on. She was a quiet woman, kind, always had a smile when she came to town. Then, about 15 years ago, she just vanished. Her truck was still at the cabin, her clothes in the closet, food in the pantry, but Elena was gone. Sheriff said she probably wandered into the woods and got lost, maybe fell into a ravine. They searched for a few weeks, then the case went cold." Margaret's voice dropped lower, her eyes darkening. "The property got tangled up in legal disputes since Elena had no family anyone could find. But here's what's always bothered me. Ridgeline Development Corporation, a big company that runs mining operations through these mountains. They tried to buy that land at least 4 times over the years. They went through lawyers, through the county, through every legal channel available. But the laws here are strict about tax-foreclosed properties. Has to go to public auction, no exceptions. So the land sat empty, and Ridgeline waited." She leaned closer, her whisper carrying the weight of 15 years of silence. "Not one person in this town has set foot on that property since Elena disappeared. Not one person has bid on it at auction year after year. Folks know to leave it alone. Some secrets are better left buried, dear. I'm telling you this because you seem decent, and I don't want to see you get hurt. Take the deed back to the county and drive away from here." Sarah looked into the old woman's eyes and saw genuine fear, genuine concern. For a moment, she considered the advice, the weight of all those warnings, the silence in the auction room, the clerk's trembling hands. But then she thought about her empty bank account, the rejection emails, the eviction notice that had torn her life apart. She had nothing left to lose. "I appreciate the warning," Sarah said quietly, gathering her bags. "But I've lost everything else. That cabin is all I have now." Margaret nodded with sad resignation. "Then God help you, child, And if you find trouble up there, come find me." Sarah walked out into the fading afternoon light and climbed into her truck. She pointed it toward the mountains, toward the cabin that had waited 15 years for someone brave or foolish enough to claim it. She did not know what she would find, but she was done running from her life, even if it meant running straight into someone else's death. The drive out of town was a slow unraveling of civilization, each mile stripping away another layer of the world Sarah had known. Paved streets gave way to gravel, and gravel eventually surrendered to a rutted dirt track that her truck's suspension protested with every jarring bump. The forest pressed in on both sides, towering pines and thick stands of fir that blocked out the afternoon sun and cast the road in a perpetual twilight. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening as she navigated around a massive pothole that could have swallowed her front tire. The county map she'd been given showed this road as a simple dotted line leading to her property. But the reality was something else entirely, a path that seemed determined to resist any traveler. The first obstacle appeared a mile in, a fallen pine log, thick as a barrel, lying across half the road. She had to veer sharply to the right, her passenger side mirror nearly scraping against a wall of brush. It could have been natural, a tree felled by wind or rot, but the cut on its base looked too clean, too deliberate. A half-mile later, the road curved sharply, and a thicket of thorny bushes had grown so dense on the left side that she was forced dangerously close to a deep drainage ditch on the right, her tires slipping on loose gravel as she inched past. Again, it could have been coincidence, nature reclaiming neglected land, but a pattern was forming in her mind, a sense that these obstacles had been cultivated, that someone had wanted this road to be difficult, to discourage the curious, to keep people away. After another 20 minutes of careful navigation, the track opened into a small clearing, and there it stood. The cabin. It was smaller than she had imagined, a single-story structure of dark, weathered logs chinked with crumbling mortar. The roof was covered in a thick carpet of moss and fallen pine needles, and one of the windows was partially obscured by a climbing vine that had worked its way up from the foundation. A stone chimney rose from one end, its surface stained with years of rain and neglect. The whole building seemed to sag under the weight of time, a forgotten thing slowly being pulled back into the earth from which it came. Sarah turned off the engine, and the silence that descended was immense, broken only by the whisper of wind through the high branches and the distant call of a bird. She stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching on a carpet of dry pine needles, and approached the cabin with cautious steps. The front porch groaned under her weight, but held. The door was unlocked, and with a push, it swung inward on rusted hinges, revealing a single large room shrouded in gloom. The smell hit her first, cold ash, damp wood, and something else beneath it, the musty scent of abandonment, of years of stillness. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. The room was sparsely furnished, but not empty. A simple wooden table stood in the center, and on it sat a ceramic mug, a faded blue ring painted around its rim, as if someone had set it down intending to return. Near the door, a heavy wool coat hung on a peg, one pocket bulging with something unseen. Against the far wall, a narrow bed frame held a bare mattress, and on the small nightstand beside it, a book lay open, its pages curled and yellowed, waiting for a reader who had never come back. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her heart beating slow and heavy in her chest. This was not the scene of a woman who had packed up and left, who had decided to abandon her life and walk away. This was a life interrupted, a moment frozen in time, a story stopped mid-sentence. Elena Vance had not left this cabin. She had been taken from it, and whoever had taken her had wanted the world to forget she ever existed. Sarah looked around at the silent relics of a vanished woman's life, and she felt a new emotion rise within her, not fear, but a cold, quiet resolve. She had come here looking for a place to disappear, But now she understood that her purpose was something else entirely. She was here to find the truth. Sarah spent the remaining hours of daylight cleaning and assessing her new home, throwing open the windows to let the stale air escape, and sweeping out years of accumulated dust and debris. She worked methodically, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the unsettling stillness of the place. The cabin, she discovered, was structurally sound despite its appearance. The logs were solid, the roof didn't leak when she tested it with water from her canteen, and the floorboards, though they creaked and groaned, held firm beneath her weight. It was neglected, not ruined, a distinction that gave her a small measure of hope. She scrubbed the table and chairs, beat the dust from the thin mattress, and cleared the fireplace of old ash, preparing it for the fire she would need once night fell. As she worked, she kept finding small traces of Elena Vance, a hairbrush in a drawer, a pair of reading glasses on a shelf, a calendar on the wall still turned to a month 15 years past. Each item was a silent testament to a life that had been violently interrupted, and Sarah handled them with a strange reverence, as though she were tending to the belongings of a ghost. The sun began to sink behind the mountains, and the light inside the cabin turned from gold to grey, to a deep, pressing darkness. Sarah lit the lantern she had bought at Margaret's store, its warm glow pushing back the shadows, but not the growing sense of unease that had settled into her bones. The wind picked up as night fell, howling through the pines with a mournful sound that seemed almost like a voice, and the cabin creaked and shifted around her, like a living thing adjusting its weight. She tried to tell herself it was just the natural sounds of an old structure in a mountain wind, but the feeling persisted, a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense that she was not entirely alone. It was during her final survey of the cabin that she noticed the cellar door. It was set into the floor in a back corner of the room, a heavy wooden hatch with an iron ring pull, half hidden beneath a threadbare rug she had moved while sweeping. She knelt and tried to lift it, but the wood had swollen from years of moisture, the edges sealed tight against the frame. She pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge, and she didn't want to risk breaking the handle or the hinges. Whatever was down there had waited 15 years. It could wait until morning, when she had better light and proper tools. She made a simple dinner of canned soup heated over the fire she had managed to coax to life in the old hearth, then prepared the bed with the sleeping bag she had brought from her truck. The mattress was thin and musty, but it was better than the floor, and exhaustion was beginning to pull at her limbs. She extinguished the lantern and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the groaning trees, the occasional skitter of something small moving across the roof. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally took her, it was not restful. She dreamed of whispered warnings, of Margaret's voice telling her that some secrets were better left buried, of shadows moving through the trees outside her window, circling the cabin with patient, predatory intent. She dreamed of a woman she had never met, a woman with kind eyes and a scientist's careful hands, running through the forest in the dark, running from something that was getting closer. She woke several times, her heart pounding, the cabin silent around her, the wind having died to a whisper. Each time, she stared into the darkness, half expecting to see a shape standing over her. But there was nothing, only the empty room and the weight of 15 years of silence pressing down on her chest. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the windows, she had barely slept at all, but her resolve had only hardened. Today, she would open that cellar door. The morning light came grey and cold through the cabin windows, and Sarah rose from her fitful sleep with a singular purpose burning in her mind. She made a quick breakfast of coffee and a granola bar, then gathered her tools, the flashlight, a crowbar she had found in the back of her truck, and a hammer. She pulled back the threadbare rug and knelt before the cellar door, studying its swollen edges and rusted iron ring. The wood had expanded with years of moisture, sealing itself into the frame, like a lid fused to a jar. She wedged the crowbar into the gap between the door and the floor, put her weight into it, and pushed. The wood groaned in protest, fibers cracking and splitting, but it held fast. She repositioned the crowbar, finding a better angle, and tried again, her muscles straining with the effort. On the third attempt, something gave way with a loud crack, and the door lifted an inch. She worked the crowbar around the edges, breaking the seal bit by bit, until finally the hatch swung upward on protesting hinges, releasing a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of earth and mildew, and something older, something that had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. A set of rough wooden steps descended into the darkness below. Sarah clicked on her flashlight and began her descent, each step creaking beneath her weight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a low-ceilinged space of packed dirt and stone walls. The cellar was larger than she had expected, extending beneath the full footprint of the cabin, and it was filled with the detritus of a life interrupted. Old furniture draped in dusty sheets crowded against the walls, a rocking chair, a writing desk, stacks of cardboard boxes with labels too faded to read. She moved through the space carefully, her flashlight sweeping over the forgotten remnants of Elena Vance's existence. She opened boxes and found old clothes, kitchen supplies, research equipment, and stacks of scientific journals. It was a time capsule, a snapshot of a life that had been abruptly abandoned. She was about to head back up when her foot struck a section of floorboard that sounded different from the rest. She stopped, stepped back, and struck it again with her heel. The sound was hollow, a resonant thump that spoke of empty space beneath. She knelt, brushing away the dirt and debris, and found a seam in the boards, a rectangular section about 3 feet by 3 feet that had been cut and set back into place. Her heart began to beat faster as she worked the crowbar into the seam and pried upward. The boards lifted away easily, revealing not more dirt but a flat concrete foundation, and set into that foundation was an iron hatch with a heavy-duty padlock securing it shut. The hatch was industrial, serious, and the kind of thing you would find on a storm shelter or a military installation. But it was the scratches that made her blood run cold, fresh scratches, bright against the dark metal, clustered around the padlock and the edges of the hatch. Someone had been down here recently, someone with tools, trying desperately to get this open. They had failed. The padlock, a massive hardened steel thing, remained intact, its shackle unmarred. Sarah sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Elena Vance had hidden something beneath her cabin, something important enough to protect with a vault-like hatch. And someone else knew about it, someone who had come here after Elena's disappearance and tried to claim it for themselves. She needed to find the key. Sarah spent the next hour examining the hatch with the meticulous attention to detail that had once made her an excellent accountant. She ran her fingers over every inch of the cold metal, studying its construction, trying to understand what she was dealing with. The hatch itself was military-grade, heavy-gauge steel with reinforced hinges and a rubber gasket around the edges, designed to create an airtight seal. This was not something Elena had picked up at a hardware store. This was specialized equipment, the kind used to protect sensitive materials from the elements, from fire, from prying eyes. But it was the padlock that troubled her most. Unlike everything else in the cabin, which bore the patina of 15 years of neglect, the padlock was relatively new. It was a high-security model, hardened steel, pick-resistant, the kind used on storage facilities and government buildings. Someone had replaced the original lock, and they had done so recently, within the last few years at most. The fresh scratches around it told a story of frustrated attempts to break through, of someone who knew what was down here and wanted it badly, but lacked the key. Sarah climbed back up to the cabin and began a systematic search of Elena's belongings, looking for anything that might open that lock. She went through every drawer, every box, every pocket of every piece of clothing still hanging in the small closet. She checked behind furniture, under the mattress, inside the cold firebox. She even examined the book that still lay open on the nightstand, flipping through its pages in case a key had been pressed between them. Nothing. If Eleanor had kept a key to that hatch, she had hidden it well, or she had kept it on her person, which meant it had vanished along with her 15 years ago. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself standing at the window, staring out at the forest, her mind churning. Her curiosity about what lay beneath that hatch was intense, almost overwhelming, but it was increasingly at war with a growing sense of dread. Elena Vance had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect something, and that protection had not saved her. Someone had wanted what she had badly enough to make her disappear, and now Sarah was standing in the same cabin, asking the same questions, following the same trail. The thought made her skin prickle with unease. Darkness came early in the mountains, the sun dropping behind the peaks and plunging the forest into a blue-grey twilight. Sarah lit her lantern and started a fire, trying to shake off the chill that had settled into her bones. She was heating water for tea when she saw them. Headlights, 2 bright points of light appearing on the road that led to her property. She froze, her hand suspended over the kettle, watching as the lights grew closer, bouncing and swaying as the vehicle navigated the rutted track. They stopped at the tree line, perhaps 100 yards from the cabin, and went still. The engine continued to run, a faint rumble she could just barely hear over the crackle of her fire. For 5 minutes, the vehicle sat there, its headlights cutting through the darkness like eyes, watching her. Sarah stood motionless at the window, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. Then, as abruptly as they had appeared, the headlights swung away, and the vehicle reversed back down the road, disappearing into the night. She was being watched, and whoever was out there wanted her to know it. Sarah slept poorly again, her dreams haunted by those watching headlights, and she woke to a morning sky heavy with grey clouds. She was standing at the window with her coffee, studying the tree line where the vehicle had stopped when she heard the sound of an engine approaching. This time, the vehicle did not stop at the edge of the property. It came all the way up the rutted track and pulled into the clearing in front of the cabin, a black SUV with tinted windows and a polish that seemed obscenely out of place against the wild, neglected landscape. Sarah set down her mug and stepped onto the porch, her posture straight, her expression guarded. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and well-built, perhaps in his late 50s, with thick silver hair swept back from a handsome face and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore an expensive charcoal overcoat over a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's truck, and his shoes, she noticed, were entirely wrong for the terrain, polished leather that would be ruined by a single walk through the muddy clearing. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to owning every room he entered, and when he smiled at her, the expression was warm, practiced, and entirely unconvincing. His eyes, a pale grey that matched the morning sky, remained cold and calculating. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice smooth and rich. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. My name is Victor Harlan. I'm the CEO of Ridgeline Development Corporation." He extended a hand, and Sarah shook it briefly, feeling the soft, uncalloused skin of a man who had never done a day of physical labor in his life. "I know who you are," she said. "Your company has been trying to buy this land for 15 years. If the directness surprised him, he didn't show it. His smile widened slightly, appreciatively, as though she had passed some kind of test. "I see you've done your homework. That's good. I admire diligence." He glanced around the clearing, his gaze lingering on the sagging porch and the moss-covered roof. "I'll be direct with you, Ms. Mitchell. This property is of interest to my company. We're planning a conservation project in this valley. Reforestation, watershed protection, that sort of thing. This parcel is a key piece of the puzzle." He reached into his coat and produced a slim leather folder. "I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for this property. Cash. That's 250 times what you paid for it. You could walk away today with enough money to start over anywhere you like. Sarah looked at the folder, but made no move to take it. And if I'm not interested in starting over somewhere else. The warmth drained from Harlan's face, like water from a sink. Beneath it was something harder, colder, a glimpse of the predator behind the polished exterior. Miss Mitchell, I'm trying to do you a favor. This cabin has a difficult history. The woman who lived here before you disappeared under circumstances that were never explained. People in town don't come up here for good reason. This is not a safe place for a woman alone. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. Take the money. Take it and leave. That would be the wise choice. Sarah met his gaze and held it, refusing to look away, refusing to let him see the fear that was coiling in her stomach. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harlan, but my answer is no. This is my home now, and I'm not going anywhere. For a long moment, Harlan stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then the smile returned, thinner and sharper than before. I see. Well, if you change your mind, you know how to reach me. He turned and walked back to his SUV, and as he opened the door, he looked back at her one last time. Be careful, Miss Mitchell. These mountains can be very unforgiving. Sarah watched Harlan's SUV disappear down the rutted track, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. His visit had confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Whatever Elena Vance had hidden beneath this cabin, it was valuable enough to threaten for, valuable enough to kill for. The polished veneer of a conservation project was a lie, and beneath it was something far darker. She needed to find out what Elena had known, what she had discovered that had made her dangerous enough to eliminate. Sarah went back inside and began to search the cabin with renewed intensity, no longer just looking for a key, but for any trace of Elena's work, any clue that might explain why Ridgeline Development had spent 15 years trying to acquire this land. She checked places she had already searched, looking more carefully this time, tapping on walls and floors, listening for hollow sounds, searching for seams and edges that might indicate hidden compartments. It was in the small bedroom closet that she found it. The closet was shallow, barely deep enough for the few items of clothing that still hung there, and something about its dimensions had been nagging at her. She stepped inside, pushing the clothes aside, and ran her hands along the back wall. It was made of thin wooden panels, and when she pressed on the one in the lower right corner, it gave slightly, shifting inward with a soft click. Her heart leapt. She pressed harder, and the panel swung open on a concealed hinge, revealing a dark space behind the wall. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it into the gap. Tucked into the narrow cavity was a weathered leather satchel, its surface cracked and dusty but otherwise intact. Sarah pulled it out with trembling hands and carried it to the table. The buckles were stiff with age, but they opened, and she reached inside. Her fingers closed around a stack of notebooks, their covers worn, their pages swollen and warped from years of humidity. She opened the first one and recognized immediately what she was looking at. Research journals filled with Eleanor Vance's neat, precise handwriting. The entries were dated, organized, methodical, the work of a trained scientist documenting her observations. The early pages contained technical data, water sample locations, chemical analysis results, pH levels, and concentrations of various compounds. But as Sarah read further, the nature of the research became clear. Elena had been studying contamination in the valley's water system, and what she had found was alarming. The journals documented elevated levels of arsenic, lead, and industrial solvents in streams and wells throughout the region. She had traced the contamination to its source, illegal dumping sites in the mountains, places where toxic waste from mining operations had been buried or discharged into waterways. And the company responsible, named again and again in Elena's careful notes, was Ridgeline Development Corporation. The final journal was different from the others. The scientific detachment gave way to something more personal, more urgent. Eleanor wrote of being followed, of threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, of finding her truck's tires slashed. She wrote of pressure from local officials to abandon her research, of doors closing everywhere she turned. But she also wrote of her determination to see it through, to compile her evidence into an irrefutable case and take it to the federal authorities. The last entry was dated 2 days before she vanished. "They know I have proof," Elena had written. "They know about the vault. I have to get the documents out before they come for me. If something happens, the truth is below. Someone has to find it. Someone has to finish what I started." Sarah closed the journal, her hands shaking. Eleanor Vance had died for this truth, and now the burden of it had passed to her. Sarah sat at the table for a long time, staring at the journals spread before her, the weight of Elena Vance's discoveries pressing down on her like a physical burden. This woman, this scientist she had never met, had uncovered a crime of staggering proportions, a systematic poisoning of the land and water that sustained an entire valley, and she had paid for that knowledge with her life. The journals were damning, filled with data and observations that painted a clear picture of corporate malfeasance, but they were also incomplete. Elena had written of proof, of documents and samples secured in the vault below, evidence irrefutable enough to bring down Ridgeline Development and everyone connected to it. Without that proof, the journals were just the notes of a missing woman, easily dismissed, easily buried. Sarah needed to get into that vault. She turned back to the satchel, hoping she had missed something in her initial examination, and began to search it more carefully. She checked the pockets, ran her fingers along the seams, and then she felt it. A small, hard lump in the lining at the very bottom of the bag. The stitching there was slightly different, newer than the rest, as though the lining had been opened and resewn. She retrieved her knife from her supplies and carefully cut the threads, peeling back the leather to reveal a small cavity that had been deliberately created. Inside was a brass key, old but well-maintained, wrapped in a piece of paper that had been folded multiple times to fit the narrow space. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted the key from its hiding place. It was small, much smaller than she had expected, but its weight felt significant in her palm, heavy with possibility and danger. She unwrapped the paper with trembling fingers and found a note written in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, the script more hurried than in the journals, the letters pressed deep into the paper, as though written with great urgency. "If something happens to me," the note read, "the proof is below. Everything you need is in the vault. The lab reports, the photographs, the recordings. It's enough to bring them down, all of them. Trust no one in this town. The sheriff is on their payroll. The county officials are compromised. Get the evidence to the EPA, the federal office in Denver. Ask for Dr. Robert Chen. He's the only one I trust. Do not go to the local authorities. Do not go to the state police. Ridgeline owns them all. And please, whoever you are, be careful. These people will kill to protect their secrets. They've already proven that." Sarah read the note 3 times, each word sinking deeper into her understanding, reshaping the reality of her situation. Elena had known they were coming for her. She had prepared for the worst, hidden the key, left instructions for whoever might come after, a message in a bottle thrown into the future, with desperate hope that someone would find it and have the courage to act, that someone was now Sarah, a woman who had come to these mountains with nothing, seeking only a quiet place to rebuild her shattered life. Instead, she had inherited a dead woman's mission and a target on her back. She looked at the key in her hand, this small brass object that held the power to expose a corporate conspiracy and bring justice to a valley full of poisoned families. She thought about Victor Harlan's cold eyes and veiled threats, about the vehicle watching her property in the darkness, about the fresh scratches on the hatch where someone had tried and failed to break through. Fear coiled in her stomach, cold and tight, but beneath it was something else, something that felt like purpose. She had lost everything that had once defined her, But perhaps that loss had prepared her for exactly this moment. She had nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose. Elena Vance had died trying to expose the truth. Sarah would not let that death be in vain. Sarah descended into the cellar, with the brass key clutched in her hand, her flashlight cutting through the damp darkness. Her footsteps on the wooden stairs seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, each creak announcing her presence to the shadows below. She crossed the packed dirt floor, navigating around the shrouded furniture and forgotten boxes, until she stood before the iron hatch set into the concrete foundation. The fresh scratches around the padlock gleamed in the beam of her flashlight, evidence of someone's desperate, failed attempts to breach this final barrier. She knelt and inserted the key into the lock, feeling the mechanism resist for a moment before the pins aligned and the shackle released with a satisfying click. She removed the padlock, set it aside, and gripped the heavy iron handle. The hatch was heavier than she expected, and she had to brace her feet and pull with all her strength before it swung upward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a metal ladder descending into darkness. A rush of cool, dry air rose from below, carrying the faint hum of machinery. Sarah directed her flashlight downward and saw the rungs disappearing into a space that seemed impossibly deep for a cabin cellar. She took a breath, steadied her nerves, and began to climb down. The ladder was about 15 feet long, and when her boots finally touched solid ground, she found herself standing in a space that took her breath away. It was a vault, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the cabin, its walls lined with metal sheeting, its ceiling reinforced with steel beams. The air was cool and dry, climate-controlled by a small generator that hummed quietly in one corner, connected to a ventilation system that kept the space at a constant temperature and humidity. Elena Vance had not just hidden her evidence, she had built a fortress to protect it. The vault was perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, and every inch of it was organized with the precision of a scientist who understood that chaos was the enemy of truth. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled with categories written in Elena's neat handwriting: water samples, soil samples, lab reports, photographs, audio recordings, correspondence, legal documents. Sarah opened the first cabinet and began to look through its contents, her hands trembling as she realized the scope of what Elena had assembled. There were laboratory reports from independent testing facilities showing toxic contamination levels in water and soil samples collected from locations throughout the valley. The numbers were staggering: arsenic and lead concentrations hundreds of times above safe limits, industrial solvents that should never have been anywhere near a watershed. There were photographs, hundreds of them, showing illegal dump sites hidden in remote mountain locations, barrels of waste half buried in the earth, pipes discharging murky fluid directly into streams. There were shipping manifests documenting the transport of hazardous materials from ridgeline mining operations to these hidden disposal sites, signed by company officials and dated over a span of years. And there were recordings, cassette tapes, and later digital files of conversations between Ridgeline executives discussing the disposal operations in explicit detail, their voices casual and unconcerned as they talked about cutting costs by avoiding proper waste treatment. One voice appeared again and again, authoritative and commanding, and Sarah recognized it immediately from that morning's visit. Victor Harlan. Elena had built an airtight case, a mountain of evidence so comprehensive and so damning that no amount of corporate lawyers or political influence could make it disappear. She had done everything right, gathered the proof, protected it, prepared to take it to the authorities, and they had silenced her before she could finish the job. Sarah stood in the center of the vault, surrounded by the meticulous work of a dead woman, and felt the full weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. This evidence could bring down Ridgeline development, could bring justice to the families who had been poisoned, could give meaning to Elena's death. But only if Sarah could get it out of these mountains alive. Sarah spent hours in the vault, methodically working through the filing cabinets, and with each document she read, each photograph she examined, The horror of what Ridgeline Development had done grew clearer and more monstrous. The contamination was not an accident, not a single spill or a momentary lapse in safety protocols. It was a systematic, years-long operation to dispose of toxic mining waste in the cheapest way possible. Consequences be damned. The shipping manifests told the story in cold, clinical detail. Thousands of barrels of hazardous materials transported from Ridgeline's mining operations to illegal dump sites scattered throughout the mountains, buried in unmarked locations, discharged into streams that fed the valley's watershed. The laboratory reports showed what happened next. The toxins seeped into the groundwater, contaminated the wells that families depended on for drinking water, poisoned the streams where children played and fishermen cast their lines, saturated the farmland where crops were grown and livestock grazed. Elena had mapped the contamination's spread with devastating precision, overlaying her water sample data with population centers and health statistics. The correlation was undeniable. Communities downstream from the dump sites showed elevated rates of cancer, respiratory illness, neurological disorders, and birth defects. Families had been getting sick for years, watching their loved ones waste away from mysterious ailments, and they had never known why. The doctors had no answers, the authorities offered no explanations, and all the while, Ridgeline Development continued to poison them, hiding behind lawyers and shell companies and a wall of official silence. But it was the final cabinet that revealed the true depth of the conspiracy, and it made Sarah's blood run cold. Elena had labeled it complicity, and inside were documents that implicated not just Ridgeline, but the very institutions that should have protected the valley's residents. There were bank records showing regular payments from Ridgeline subsidiaries to local officials, the county health inspector who had ignored complaints about water quality, the planning commissioner who had approved permits for the dump sites, the state environmental officer who had buried reports of contamination. And at the center of it all, receiving the largest and most frequent payments, was Sheriff Tom Bradley. The sheriff's file was thick with evidence of his corruption. Elena had obtained copies of his personal bank statements, showing deposits that far exceeded his official salary. She had photographed him meeting with Victor Harlan at a remote location, the two men shaking hands beside a black SUV. She had even managed to record a phone conversation in which Bradley assured Harlan that the Vance problem would be handled quietly, and that the investigation into her disappearance would go nowhere. Sarah listened to the recording with a growing sense of nausea, hearing the casual way these men discussed the elimination of a human being, a woman whose only crime had been seeking the truth. Sheriff Bradley had not just looked the other way while Ridgeline poisoned the valley. He had actively participated in covering up Elena's murder, had ensured that her case went cold, had protected the men responsible for her death, and he was still in office, still wearing a badge, still wielding the authority of the law. Sarah understood now why Elena's note had warned her to trust no one in this town, why she had insisted the evidence go directly to the federal authorities. The corruption was not limited to one company or one official. It was a network, a web of complicity that stretched from the corporate boardroom to the sheriff's office, binding together everyone who had profited from the valley's poisoning. Going to the local police would be suicide. Going to the state authorities might be just as dangerous. She needed help from outside, someone with no connections to this place, someone who could take this evidence and blow the conspiracy wide open. She thought of Margaret, the old shopkeeper who had warned her about the cabin, and wondered if she might know someone who could be trusted. Sarah drove into town, with her hands tight on the steering wheel, and her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The evidence she had discovered in Elena's vault was a bomb waiting to explode, and she was acutely aware that carrying this knowledge made her a target. She had spent a sleepless night in the cabin, every creak of the old logs, and every whisper of wind through the pines sending her heart racing, and by morning she had known with certainty that she could not do this alone. She needed an ally, someone outside the web of corruption that had strangled this valley, and there was only one person she could think of who might help. The bell above Peterson's general store chimed as Sarah pushed through the door. and Margaret looked up from behind the counter with an expression that shifted quickly from welcome to concern. The old woman's sharp eyes took in Sarah's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, and she immediately set down the inventory list she had been reviewing. "Close the door," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying an urgency that Sarah had not heard before. "Lock it and turn the sign to closed." Sarah did as she was told, and when she turned back, Margaret was already coming around the counter, gesturing toward a small back room behind a curtain of hanging beads. They sat at a worn wooden table, surrounded by boxes of stock and old ledgers, and Margaret poured them each a cup of coffee from a pot that had been warming on a small hot plate. Her hands, Sarah noticed, were not quite steady. "You found something," Margaret said. It was not a question. Sarah nodded and began to talk. She told Margaret about the hidden satchel and Elena's research journals, about the brass key, and the note warning her to trust no one. She told her about the vault carved into the bedrock, about the filing cabinets filled with evidence of systematic poisoning, about the laboratory reports and photographs and recordings that proved Ridgeline Development had been dumping toxic waste into the valley's watershed for years. And she told her about the documents implicating Sheriff Bradley, the bank records and photographs, and the recorded conversation in which he discussed handling the Vance problem. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation, her coffee sitting untouched and cooling in her hands. When Sarah finished, the old woman sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the table. And when she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "I knew," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. "God help me. I think I always knew. People getting sick, the water tasting wrong, Eleanor asking questions and then just vanishing. I told myself it was coincidence, told myself there had to be another explanation, because the alternative was too terrible to accept. I was a coward." Sarah reached across the table and took the old woman's hand. "You're not a coward. You were afraid, and you had every reason to be. These people are dangerous." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and drew a shaky breath. "My nephew," she said slowly. "His name is Daniel Torres. He's an investigative journalist in Denver, a good one. He's been trying to expose Ridgeline for years, but he's never been able to get enough evidence to make a case. If you could get him what's in that vault." She trailed off, the possibility hanging in the air between them. "Can you contact him?" Sarah asked. "Can you trust him?" Margaret nodded firmly. "With my life, he's a good man, and he's been waiting for a break like this. I'll call him today. Tell him what you found. He'll know what to do." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, the first easing of the terrible pressure that had been building since she opened that hatch. She was no longer alone. The harassment began the very next day, swift and coordinated, a campaign designed to break her will and drive her from the land. Sarah was outside splitting firewood when a white county truck came bouncing up the rutted track and pulled into the clearing. A thin man in a too-clean uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand, and introduced himself as a building inspector responding to a complaint. He walked through her cabin with a critical eye, making notes on his clipboard, clicking his tongue at things that had stood unchanged for decades. He cited her for a faulty chimney flue, for inadequate insulation, for a septic system that he claimed was not up to code. The violations, he informed her with bureaucratic indifference, carried fines totaling several $1,000s and required immediate remediation. When Sarah protested that no one had complained, that the cabin had stood here for 50 years without issue, he simply shrugged and handed her the paperwork. 2 days later, a registered letter arrived from the county assessor's office informing her that her property boundaries were being formally disputed. According to the letter, a survey error had been discovered in the original deed, and a neighboring parcel owner was claiming that a significant portion of her land actually belonged to them. The matter would be resolved through legal proceedings that could take months or even years, and in the meantime, she was advised not to make any improvements to the disputed sections, Sarah recognized the tactic from Elena's journals. Bury the target in legal paperwork, drain their resources, make their life so difficult that leaving seems like the only option. She drove into town to buy supplies and returned to find her truck sitting lower than it should. All 4 tires had been slashed, deep cuts through the sidewalls that could not be patched, only replaced. The cost would eat through most of her remaining cash, and the nearest tire shop was an hour away, meaning she would need to have the truck towed at additional expense. A small crowd had gathered to watch from across the street, and not one of them would meet her eyes. They knew who had done this, and they were too afraid to speak. That night, Sarah woke to a sound on the porch, a heavy thump followed by silence. She grabbed the flashlight and the hunting rifle she had found in Elena's closet and approached the front door, with her heart pounding against her ribs. She eased the door open and swept the beam across the porch. The light fell on a shape that made her stomach lurch. A dead deer, its throat cut, its blood pooling on the weathered boards. Pinned to its flank with a hunting knife was a piece of paper with words scrawled in red marker. "Leave while you can." Sarah stood in the doorway, staring at the grotesque warning, and felt the fear wrap around her chest like a cold hand. This was what Elena had faced, the same escalating terror designed to isolate and intimidate, to make her feel hunted and alone. And Elena had not survived it. For a moment, Sarah considered taking the money, packing up her few belongings, and driving away from this cursed place. She could start over somewhere else, forget she had ever found that vault, let someone else fight this battle. But then she thought about the families downstream who were still drinking poisoned water, still watching their children get sick, still wondering why no one would help them. She thought about Elena, who had given everything to expose the truth. Running would mean letting them win, letting all of it be for nothing. Sarah dragged the deer off the porch and buried it in the woods behind the cabin. Then she went back inside, locked the door, and began making copies of the most critical evidence. She was not going to run. She was going to fight. The weather forecast came through on the small battery-powered radio Sarah had bought in town, and the news made her blood run cold. A massive winter storm system was barreling down from Canada, carrying with it the promise of heavy snow, high winds, and temperatures that would plunge well below zero. The meteorologists were calling it the worst storm in a decade, warning residents to stock up on supplies and prepare for the possibility of being snowed in for days. Sarah stood at the cabin window, watching the sky darken to the color of bruised steel, and understood with terrible clarity what this storm meant for her. She would be trapped, cut off from town, from help, from any possibility of escape. The roads would become impassable, and the isolation that had once felt like a refuge would become a cage. If Ridgeline and their people wanted to make a move against her, this storm would give them the perfect cover. She worked frantically through the afternoon and into the evening, racing against the approaching weather. She descended into the vault and began the painstaking process of photographing the most critical documents. The laboratory reports showing contamination levels, the shipping manifests proving illegal dumping, the bank records implicating Sheriff Bradley, the photographs of dump sites and clandestine meetings. Her camera clicked again and again, capturing page after page, and she transferred the images to her laptop, organizing them into folders, creating a digital archive of Elena's life work. When she had photographed everything she could, she began making copies. She loaded the files onto USB drives, onto memory cards, onto every piece of portable storage she had. She could not risk having all the evidence in one place, could not allow a single fire or a single theft to destroy 15 years of meticulous documentation. She hid the copies in different locations around the property, one buried in a waterproof container beneath a distinctive rock formation, one tucked into a hollow tree at the edge of the clearing, one sealed in a jar and placed in the back of a crawl space beneath the cabin that she had discovered while searching for the original key. The originals remained in the vault, protected by the reinforced hatch, and the bedrock itself. The first snowflakes began to fall as the sun set, fat and heavy and silent, drifting down through the pines like a white curtain slowly closing. Sarah retrieved the prepaid phone she had purchased in town and dialed the number Margaret had given her for Daniel Torres. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert, and Sarah spoke quickly, knowing the storm might cut communications at any moment. She told him who she was and what she had found, compressing Elena's story and the vault's contents into a few urgent minutes. She could hear his breathing quicken as he grasped the significance of what she was describing, the weight of evidence she was offering. She used the cabin's weak satellite internet connection to send him a selection of the most damning files, a preliminary package that would give him enough to understand the scope of the conspiracy. Then she established the contingency plan. "If you don't hear from me by noon tomorrow," she told him, "you take what I've sent you, and you go to the FBI, not the state police, not the local sheriff, the federal authorities, and you tell them to come to these coordinates with everything they've got." She gave him the GPS location of the cabin, made him repeat it back to her, and then the line went dead as the storm killed the signal. The snow was falling heavily now, the wind beginning to howl through the pines. Sarah was alone, armed with a hunting rifle and the truth, waiting for whatever the night would bring. The blizzard struck with a fury that seemed almost personal, as though the mountains themselves had turned against her. Within hours, the world outside the cabin disappeared beneath a churning white chaos of wind and snow, the trees vanishing into the maelstrom, and the clearing becoming an undifferentiated void of swirling white. The temperature plummeted, and the wind shrieked through the pines with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming, battering against the cabin walls, with enough force to make the old logs groan and shudder. Sarah fed the fire constantly, trying to keep the cold at bay, but tendrils of icy air found their way through every crack and gap, and her breath plumed white even inside the cabin. She tried to rest, knowing she would need her strength, but sleep would not come. She sat in the old rocking chair with the hunting rifle across her lap, watching the windows, listening to the storm, waiting. It was just past midnight when she heard the first sound that did not belong. It came during a brief lull in the wind, a momentary pause in the howling that allowed other sounds to emerge. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the deep snow outside the cabin. Sarah's heart seized in her chest. She held her breath, straining to hear, and the sound came again, closer now, circling around the side of the cabin toward the back. Then she saw the shadow, a dark shape passing across the window, briefly blocking the faint ambient glow of the snow-covered clearing before disappearing from view. They had come. The storm that had trapped her had also provided them with perfect cover. A world of white noise and zero visibility, where screams would be swallowed by the wind and footprints would be buried within minutes. Sarah moved quickly, her body running on adrenaline and instinct. She pushed the heavy wooden table against the front door, wedging it tight, then stacked chairs on top of it to add weight. She closed and latched the interior shutters on the windows, old wooden panels that Elena must have installed for exactly this purpose, and braced them with boards she had stored by the fireplace. The cabin became a fortress, dark and close, the only light coming from the fire, and a single lantern she kept burning low. She took up a position in the center of the room, back to the wall, rifle raised to her shoulder, and waited. The sounds continued throughout the night, footsteps circling the cabin, testing the doors and windows, looking for weakness. She heard voices once, low and muffled by the storm, conferring somewhere near the back of the cabin, and then a heavy thump against the rear door, an exploratory push to see if it would give. It held, but Sarah knew the barricades would not last forever against determined attackers with tools. They were probing her defenses, learning the layout, waiting for the right moment to strike. She did not fire, did not reveal her position or her armament, did not give them any information they did not already have. The night became a terrifying game of cat and mouse, predators circling their prey, waiting for exhaustion or fear, or a single mistake to give them the opening they needed. Sarah's arms ached from holding the rifle, and her eyes burned from staring into the darkness. But she did not waver. She thought of Elena, alone in this same cabin, facing the same enemies, and she drew strength from the dead woman's courage. She would not make it easy for them. She would not go quietly. The break-in attempt came. In the darkest hours before dawn, when exhaustion weighed heaviest, and the mind played tricks in the flickering shadows. Sarah had been fighting to stay alert for hours, her eyes burning, her muscles cramping from tension, when she heard a new sound cut through the howling wind, the sharp crack of splintering wood from the back of the cabin. They were done waiting. She spun toward the sound, rifle raised, and saw the interior shutter on the back window buckle inward as something heavy struck it from outside. Another blow, and the wooden slats began to give way, a gap appearing between them, and through that gap she glimpsed a dark shape, a shoulder and arm forcing through, reaching for the latch that would let them in. Sarah did not hesitate. She aimed at the ceiling above the window and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and the shot was deafening in the enclosed space. A thunderclap that seemed to shake the very walls. The bullet punched through the roof, harmless, but unmistakable, and the effect was immediate. The arm withdrew. The pressure on the shutter ceased, and she heard cursing and scrambling outside as the attackers retreated from the unexpected resistance. Silence followed, broken only by the moan of the wind and the pounding of Sarah's heart. She kept the rifle trained on the damaged window, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, waiting for the next assault. Instead, a voice came from outside, raised to carry over the storm, but muffled by the walls, coming from somewhere near the front of the cabin. "Miss Mitchell." The voice was familiar, smooth even now, but stripped of its earlier pretense of civility. Victor Harlan. "That was unwise. My men are not accustomed to being shot at, and their patience is limited." Sarah said nothing, did not move from her position, did not give him any indication of where she was standing. "Let's be reasonable," Harlan continued, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to negotiating from a position of absolute power. "You have something that belongs to me. Documents, recordings, research materials that were stolen from my company by a troubled woman who is no longer with us. I want them back, all of them. Hand over everything Elena Vance collected, and you can walk away from this. I'll even let you keep the property. You have my word that no harm will come to you." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of the promise. His word, the word of a man who had poisoned a valley, who had ordered the murder of a scientist, who had corrupted law enforcement and bought politicians. The word of a man who was standing outside her cabin in a blizzard with armed men trying to break down her door. Elena had not cooperated, had not handed over her evidence, had not trusted Harlan's promises, and Elena had vanished, her body dumped in an unmarked grave. Cooperation meant death, just a quieter and more convenient death for Harlan and his people. "I know you're scared," Harlan called, out. And now there was an edge to his voice, the smoothness beginning to crack. "But you need to understand your situation. No one is coming to help you. The roads are impassable, the phones are down, and the sheriff works for me. You are alone out here, Ms. Mitchell, completely alone, and this storm is going to last for days." He let that sink in before continuing. "You can't win this. All you can do is decide how much you want to suffer before the inevitable. Give me what I want, and this ends. Refuse, and my men will come in there and take it, and you will not enjoy the experience." Sarah steadied her breathing, steadied her aim, and made her choice. She would not open that door. She would not surrender. If they wanted Elena's truth, they would have to kill her first. The silence after Harlan's ultimatum stretched for what felt like an eternity, the wind howling around the cabin, Sarah's finger resting on the trigger as she waited for the next move. When it came, it was not another attempt to breach the doors or windows. It was something far worse. She heard Harlan's voice again, colder now, stripped of all pretense of negotiation, issuing a command to his men that she could not quite make out over the storm. Then came the sound of breaking glass as the already damaged back window shattered completely, and something splashed through the opening, liquid hitting the wooden floor with a distinctive splatter. The smell hit her instantly, sharp and unmistakable. Lantern oil spreading across the dry floorboards, soaking into wood that had been seasoned by decades of mountain air. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She lunged toward the back of the cabin, hoping to stop what was coming. But she was too late. A second later, a burning torch sailed through the broken window, tumbling end over end, trailing sparks and flame. It landed in the pool of accelerant, and the world erupted. The fire caught with a sound like a giant's breath, a great whoosh of ignition that sent flames racing across the floor and up the walls with terrifying speed. The old dry logs, the perfect fuel, began to burn almost immediately, orange and yellow tongues of fire climbing toward the ceiling, the heat hitting Sarah like a physical wall. Thick black smoke billowed from the burning wood, filling the cabin within seconds, choking her, blinding her, making it impossible to breathe. She dropped to the floor where the air was marginally clearer and crawled toward the corner where she had left her pack. Her lungs screamed for oxygen, her eyes streaming tears, but she found the bag by touch and pulled it to her chest. Inside were the backup copies of the evidence, the USB drives and memory cards that held the digital archive of Elena's work. The originals were in the vault below, protected by the fireproof construction and the bedrock itself, but she could not stay here to burn with them. She had to get out. The front door was barricaded and certainly guarded. The windows were blocked, or broken and covered by Harlan's men. But there was another way. Sarah crawled across the smoke-filled room, staying low, navigating by memory toward the cellar door. The heat was intensifying, the fire consuming the cabin with voracious speed, the roar of the flames mixing with the howl of the wind outside to create a sound like the end of the world. She found the cellar hatch by touch, her fingers closing around the iron ring, and she pulled it open, a rush of cooler air rising from below. She did not hesitate. She swung her legs into the opening and descended the ladder, pulling the hatch closed above her to buy precious seconds. The cellar was dark but clear of smoke, the air cold and breathable. She crossed to the iron hatch that led to the vault and climbed down, her boots hitting the concrete floor of Elena's hidden sanctuary. Above her, she could hear the cabin dying, the crash of collapsing timbers, the hungry crackle of flames consuming everything. But the vault held. The reinforced steel and the surrounding bedrock kept the fire at bay, kept the temperature stable, kept Elena's evidence safe. Sarah allowed herself one breath of relief, then moved to the far end of the vault, where Elena had noted a secondary exit on one of her diagrams, an emergency escape tunnel that led out to a concealed opening 50 yards from the cabin. She found the narrow passage and began to crawl, dragging her pack behind her, leaving the burning cabin behind, and emerging into the blizzard, into the freezing white chaos of the storm. She was out. She was alive, and the truth had survived. Sarah emerged from the escape tunnel into a world of white chaos and bitter cold, the blizzard swallowing her immediately in its howling fury. Behind her, the cabin was a pillar of flame against the darkness, orange and yellow fire reaching toward the sky, casting a hellish glow across the snow-covered clearing that made the swirling flakes look like sparks rising from a forge. She could see dark shapes moving near the inferno, Harlan's men silhouetted against the blaze, and she knew she had only moments before they realized she was not inside, that their prey had escaped the trap. She did not wait. She turned and plunged into the forest, away from the burning cabin, away from the men who wanted her dead, into the deep snow and the impenetrable darkness of the mountain wilderness. The cold hit her like a physical assault, the wind driving ice crystals into her face, her inadequate clothing instantly soaked by the blowing snow. She had her pack with the backup evidence, a flashlight she dared not use, and nothing else. No food, no proper winter gear, no shelter. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind chill made it far worse. She knew with cold certainty that she would die out here if she stopped moving, that the mountain would kill her as surely as Harlan's men if she gave it the chance. But Sarah had one advantage that her pursuers did not. She knew this: terrain. In the weeks since she had arrived at the cabin, she had spent hours exploring the surrounding wilderness, hiking through the ravines and ridges, learning the landscape the way she had once learned spreadsheets and financial reports. She had mapped it in her mind, noting landmarks and terrain features, trails and obstacles, and now that mental map was the only thing keeping her alive. She moved through the forest with desperate purpose, her boots punching through the deep snow, her lungs burning with the effort of breathing the frigid air. She followed a ravine she had discovered during one of her hikes, a narrow cut in the mountainside that was sheltered from the worst of the wind, and too steep and treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with it to navigate in darkness. The snow was shallower here, protected by the steep walls, and she made better time, putting distance between herself and the burning cabin. Behind her, she heard shouts, Harlan's men spreading out to search for her, but the sounds were muffled by the storm, directionless, impossible to pinpoint. They would be struggling in the deep snow, fighting the wind, unable to see more than a few feet in front of them. They did not know these mountains, did not know the hidden paths and sheltered routes, and the blizzard that had been her prison was now her ally, covering her tracks almost as soon as she made them, swallowing her into its white embrace. The cold was brutal, relentless, seeping into her bones despite her constant movement. Her fingers grew numb, then her toes, and she knew that frostbite was setting in, that she was paying a price for survival that she would carry for the rest of her life. But she did not stop. She pushed forward through the howling darkness, climbing when the terrain demanded it, descending when it allowed, always moving away from danger, always moving toward the slim hope of survival. She thought of Elena Vance, who had died trying to protect this truth, and she thought of the families downstream who were still being poisoned, still watching their children get sick, and she drew strength from their suffering. She would not let their pain be for nothing. She would not let Harlan win. The evidence in her pack would survive this night, even if she did not. Sarah stumbled through the pre-dawn darkness, her body failing, her mind growing sluggish from the cold. She had been moving for hours, pushing through snow that sometimes reached her waist, climbing over fallen logs and around rock outcroppings, and her strength was nearly gone. Her fingers and toes had passed from painful to numb, to a terrifying absence of sensation, and she knew that meant tissue damage, frostbite that would leave permanent scars if she survived long enough to heal. Her wet clothing had frozen stiff against her skin, and violent shivers racked her body, her muscles burning precious energy, trying to generate heat. She needed shelter, needed it desperately, or the mountain would finish what Harlan's men had started. It was then that she saw the dark opening in the hillside, a shadow within shadows that she recognized from one of her earlier explorations, the abandoned mine shaft, a relic of some long-forgotten prospecting operation, its entrance half collapsed but still passable. She had discovered it weeks ago during a hike, and had noted its location almost absently, never imagining it would become her salvation. She crawled through the narrow opening, her frozen clothing scraping against the rocks, and found herself in a passage that extended back into the hillside, protected from the wind and the snow, the temperature noticeably warmer, simply by virtue of being out of the elements. She pulled herself deeper into the shaft, until she found a small chamber where the ceiling was high enough to sit upright. And there she stopped, her back against the cold stone wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. She needed to get warm, needed to address the hypothermia before it killed her. With trembling hands that barely responded to her commands, she opened her pack and found the emergency supplies she had stuffed inside: a small first aid kit, a space blanket, chemical hand warmers. She tore open the warmers and shoved them inside her clothing, against her core, then wrapped the space blanket around her body, creating a cocoon that would trap whatever heat she could generate. It was not enough, not nearly enough, but it was something. As the shivering slowly began to subside, she remembered the prepaid phone. She dug it out of her pack with clumsy fingers and powered it on, praying that the battery had survived the cold, that she could get a signal this deep in the mountains. The screen lit up, dim but functional, and she saw a single bar of reception. It would have to be enough. She dialed Daniel Torres, and he answered on the first ring, his voice sharp with worry. "Sarah, where are you? I saw reports of a fire." She cut him off, her voice hoarse and weak. "Listen to me. I don't have much time. They burned the cabin, but the vault survived. The evidence is still there, underground. I'm sending you my coordinates now." She fumbled with the phone, managing to share her location. "If you don't hear from me by noon today, you go to the FBI, not the state police, the federal authorities. You tell them everything, and you send them to these coordinates with a tactical team. Do you understand?" There was a pause, and when Daniel spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I understand. Noon. FBI. Tactical team. Sarah, hold on. I'm going to get you help." The signal wavered and died before she could respond. She lowered the phone and leaned her head back against the stone, the space blanket crackling around her. The contingency was in place. If she died in this mine shaft, the truth would still come out. But she was not ready to die. She closed her eyes and focused on breathing, on staying warm, on surviving until help could reach her. Noon was 6 hours away. She just had to last until then. The storm began to break near mid-morning, the howling wind dying to a whisper, the clouds thinning to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The world that emerged was transformed, buried under feet of pristine white snow that glittered in the weak winter sunlight like a field of crushed diamonds. It was beautiful and deadly, and Sarah knew that the clearing weather was both a blessing and a curse. She could move more easily now, could see where she was going, but so could her hunters. From her refuge in the mine shaft, she heard them before she saw them, the distant sound of voices calling to each other, the mechanical whine of snowmobiles echoing off the mountainsides. Harlan's men were spreading out across the terrain, conducting a systematic search, and they were equipped for the task. Through a gap in the rocks near the mine entrance, she watched 2 of them pass within 100 yards of her position, dressed in white winter camouflage and carrying military-grade rifles, moving with the coordinated efficiency of professionals. One of them held a device that she recognized as a thermal imaging scanner, sweeping it across the landscape, searching for the heat signature of a human body. She pressed herself deeper into the cold stone of the mine shaft, trusting the rock to mask her presence, and they moved on without detecting her. But she could not stay hidden forever. The evidence in the vault was the ultimate prize, the weapon that could bring down Ridgeline development, and everyone connected to it. And sooner or later Harlan would realize that it had survived the fire. He would send his men back to the ruins of the cabin to search the cellar, and when they found the hatch, they would break through it with tools or explosives and destroy everything Elena had spent years compiling. Sarah could not let that happen. She had to get back to the cabin first, had to protect the vault until help arrived. She waited until the hunters had moved further up the mountain, their voices fading into the distance, then slipped out of the mine shaft and began to move. She traveled carefully, using every trick she had learned in her weeks of exploring this wilderness. She stayed in the trees where the canopy had kept the snow shallower, walked on rocks and fallen logs where she could to minimize her tracks, and used the terrain to stay out of sight lines. The hunters were professionals, but they were outsiders, unfamiliar with this specific landscape, relying on technology and numbers rather than intimate knowledge of the land. Sarah had walked these ravines and ridges dozens of times. She knew where the ground was treacherous beneath the snow, where the thickets were too dense to penetrate, where the sight lines were clear, and where they were blocked. She moved from cover to cover, always listening, always watching, circling wide around the search parties, and working her way back toward the cabin. Twice she had to freeze and press herself into the snow as hunters passed nearby, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they would hear it. Once she heard a shout from somewhere to her north, a false alarm that drew several of the searchers away from her path and gave her a window to move. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows shortened, and she pushed herself forward despite her exhaustion and her injuries, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. The cabin was less than a mile away now. The vault was waiting, and somewhere behind her, the hunters were closing in. Sarah reached the burned-out cabin just before noon, approaching from the tree line with agonizing caution, scanning for any sign of Harlan's men. The structure was a blackened skeleton, the log walls collapsed into heaps of charred timber, smoke still rising in thin wisps from the ruins. But the stone chimney stood intact, and more importantly, the cellar beneath remained undisturbed, the entrance hidden beneath a fall of debris. She picked her way through the wreckage, the acrid smell of burnt wood filling her nostrils, the heat still radiating from the deeper piles of ash. She found the cellar hatch beneath a collapsed beam and managed to shift it aside, her injured hands screaming in protest, then descended the ladder into the cool darkness below. The cellar was untouched by the fire, the packed earth walls and stone foundation having protected it from the inferno above. And when she crossed to the iron hatch and climbed down into the vault, she nearly wept with relief. Everything was exactly as she had left it, the filing cabinets full of evidence, the laboratory reports and photographs and recordings that documented 15 years of corporate crime. Elena's legacy had survived. She was examining the cabinets, making sure nothing had been disturbed, when she heard the sound from above. Footsteps on the cellar stairs, multiple sets of boots descending with deliberate, unhurried confidence. She spun toward the ladder, reaching for the hatch, but she was too late. A face appeared in the opening above her, and then another, men in tactical gear, with rifles trained down into the vault. And then, descending the ladder, with the casual ease of a man who owned everything he surveyed, came Victor Harlan. He stepped off the ladder and into the vault, his expensive coat exchanged for winter camouflage, a pistol held loosely in his gloved hand. His silver hair was disheveled, his face reddened by the cold, but his eyes held the same flat, reptilian calm she had seen at their first meeting. He looked around the vault with an expression of satisfied curiosity, taking in the filing cabinets and their neatly labeled contents. "Impressive," he said, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "Eleanor was more thorough than I gave her credit for. I always wondered what she was hiding down here." He turned his gaze to Sarah, and his smile held no warmth at all. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Miss Mitchell. The fire, the chase, men injured, attention drawn to operations I've spent years keeping quiet, all because you couldn't accept a generous offer and walk away." He began to pace slowly, the pistol hanging at his side, his tone shifting to something almost conversational. "Do you have any idea how much money flows through Ridgeline Development? Hundreds of millions of dollars. We employ thousands of people, fund political campaigns, support community programs. We are the economy of this region. And yes, there are costs to that success. There are always costs. A few barrels of waste buried in the mountains, some contamination in water that nobody was drinking anyway. Acceptable trade-offs for progress." His voice hardened. Elena didn't understand that. She thought her research mattered more than jobs, more than growth, more than the entire economic ecosystem I've built. She thought she could bring me down with her little collection of papers. She was wrong. He stopped pacing and faced Sarah directly, raising the pistol. "You've seen my files. You know that I own the sheriff, the county commissioners, half the state legislature. There is no authority you can appeal to that I don't already control. There is no escape. Elena learned that lesson, and now you'll learn it too." Sarah stood frozen, her back against the cold filing cabinets, staring down the barrel of his gun. She thought of Elena, who had stood in this same vault, who had gathered this same evidence, who had been silenced before she could use it. She thought of Daniel Torres waiting for her call, of the FBI contingency that would only trigger if she failed to make contact. Noon had passed. The clock was ticking. Harlan's finger tightened on the trigger, and Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the shot that would end her life. But instead of a gunshot, a different sound filled the air, distant at first, but growing rapidly louder. A rhythmic, percussive thump that vibrated through the stone walls of the vault and seemed to shake the very earth around them. Helicopters, and not just one but several, their rotors beating the air with increasing intensity as they approached the mountain. Harlan froze, his head snapping up towards the ceiling, his expression shifting from cold confidence to sudden uncertainty. He barked an order to his men above, demanding to know what was happening, and the response that came back down was panicked, fragmented, voices shouting over each other about aircraft and vehicles, and armed personnel converging on their position. Daniel Torres had not waited until noon. He had called the FBI the moment Sarah's signal went dead, had given them everything she had sent him, had convinced them that a woman's life hung in the balance and that the evidence she was protecting could bring down a corporate conspiracy of staggering proportions. The Bureau had mobilized with remarkable speed, coordinating with state police, assembling a tactical team and launching toward the coordinates Sarah had provided. Now, they were here, and Harlan's kingdom of corruption was crumbling around him. The sounds from above grew more chaotic. Helicopter rotors thundering directly overhead, vehicles roaring up the access road, amplified voices ordering everyone to drop their weapons and surrender. Harlan's men, professionals who understood when a situation had turned irretrievably against them, did not resist. Sarah heard the clatter of rifles being thrown down, the thud of bodies hitting the ground as they complied with commands to lie flat with their hands visible. But Harlan was not ready to surrender. His face contorted with rage, the polished veneer finally shattering completely, and he swung the pistol back towards Sarah with a snarl of pure hatred. If he was going down, he intended to take her with him, to destroy the witness who had brought his empire to ruin. Sarah did not think. She reacted on pure instinct, lunging forward as his arm came up, driving her shoulder into his chest before he could bring the weapon to bear. They crashed together against the filing cabinets, metal screeching against stone, and the pistol discharged into the ceiling, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Sarah grabbed for his gun hand, fighting to keep the barrel pointed away from her body, and they struggled desperately, crashing into walls, knocking over equipment, grappling for control of the weapon. Harlan was stronger than he looked, his face twisted with fury, and he managed to throw her off, sending her sprawling across the floor. He raised the pistol again, his breath ragged, his eyes wild, but before he could fire, shapes dropped through the hatch above them, dark figures in tactical gear, rappelling into the vault with weapons raised. Voices screamed commands, laser sights painted red dots across Harlan's chest, and finally, he let the pistol fall from his fingers and raised his hands in surrender. Agents swarmed him, forcing him to his knees, wrenching his arms behind his back and securing them with handcuffs. Sarah lay on the cold floor of the vault, her body aching, her hands bleeding, watching as Victor Harlan was hauled to his feet and dragged toward the ladder. His eyes found hers one last time, burning with impotent rage, but he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. An agent knelt beside her, asking if she was injured, calling for a medic, and Sarah managed to nod. She was injured, exhausted, half-frozen, and pushed beyond every limit she had ever known. But she was alive, and the nightmare was finally over. The evidence from Elena's vault detonated like a bomb at the heart of the region's power structure. its shockwaves rippling outward to topple institutions that had stood corrupt and unchallenged for more than a decade. Federal investigators arrived within days of Harlan's arrest, a small army of FBI agents and EPA officials who descended on the valley with subpoenas and search warrants, seizing records and interviewing witnesses, methodically dismantling the web of complicity that had allowed Ridgeline Development to poison the land with impunity. The case was massive, sprawling across multiple jurisdictions and involving dozens of subjects, but Elena Vance had done most of the work for them. Her meticulous documentation, her laboratory reports and photographs and recordings provided a roadmap of corporate malfeasance, so detailed and so damning that defense attorneys began negotiating plea deals before the first indictments were even handed down. Ridgeline Development Corporation was gutted, its assets frozen, its operations suspended, its stock rendered worthless as investors fled. The company that had once dominated the regional economy, that had funded politicians and controlled officials and shaped policy to suit its interests, ceased to exist as a functioning entity within weeks of the raid. Victor Harlan was charged with enough crimes to keep him in prison for the rest of his life. Environmental violations carrying decades of potential sentences, corruption and bribery charges, obstruction of justice, and most seriously, conspiracy to commit murder in connection with Elena Vance's disappearance. He proclaimed his innocence from the moment of his arrest, hiring a team of expensive lawyers to contest every charge. But the evidence was overwhelming, and when 3 of his former employees agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences, his fate was sealed. Sheriff Tom Bradley was arrested at his home on a quiet Tuesday morning, led out in handcuffs in front of his neighbors, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, as if he had never truly believed this day would come. 6 other local officials followed him into custody over the next week: the county health inspector, the planning commissioner, the state environmental officer, and 3 members of the county board of supervisors, all of them captured in Elena's documents, receiving payments from Ridgeline subsidiaries, all of them complicit in the cover-up of crimes that had sickened hundreds of families. The dominoes fell one after another, and with each arrest, the valley's residents watched with a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction as the corruption that had ruled their lives was finally dragged into the light. But the most important discovery came 2 weeks into the investigation, when a team of forensic specialists followed coordinates found in Elena's own notes to a remote section of Ridgeline property. There, in an unmarked grave beneath a stand of pine trees, they found human remains that dental records confirmed belonged to Elena Vance. She had been murdered, shot twice in the back of the head execution style, and buried in a shallow pit that was meant to hide her forever. After 15 years of silence, 15 years of her case sitting cold and unsolved in a filing cabinet, Elena was finally coming home. The funeral was held on a clear spring morning, the valley's residents turning out in numbers that would have astonished the quiet, private woman who had lived alone on the mountain. They came to pay respects to a scientist who had given her life trying to protect them, who had seen the truth and refused to look away, who had been silenced, but not defeated. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground, and she felt a profound sense of completion. Elena Vance had found justice at last. In the weeks following the arrests, Sarah worked closely with Daniel Torres to tell the full story of Elena Vance's sacrifice and the conspiracy that had silenced her. Daniel was everything Margaret had promised, a skilled journalist with a fierce commitment to truth, a man who understood that this story was not just about corporate crime, but about a woman who had given her life to protect people she had never met. Together, they spent hours in his Denver office, Sarah recounting every detail of her discovery, while Daniel recorded and took notes, his questions sharp and probing, but always respectful of the weight she carried. The article he published was exhaustive and devastating, a 10,000-word investigation that laid bare the full scope of Ridgeline's crimes and the corruption that had enabled them, and it was picked up by national outlets within hours of its release. The story spread across the country, shared and discussed and debated, and suddenly, the quiet valley in the Montana mountains was at the center of a national conversation about corporate accountability and environmental justice. The cleanup began that spring, a massive federal operation that would take years to complete. EPA teams in hazmat suits descended on the illegal dump sites Eleanor had documented, excavating thousands of barrels of toxic waste, remediating contaminated soil, and installing filtration systems to purify the poisoned groundwater. The work was slow and expensive, funded by assets seized from Ridgeline and its executives, but for the first time in over a decade, the valley's watershed was being healed rather than destroyed. Families who had suffered for years from mysterious illnesses finally received answers and care, as federal health officials established a clinic in town specifically to treat conditions related to toxic exposure. There were diagnoses that brought grief but also relief, the terrible comfort of finally knowing why a child had developed cancer or why a father had lost the use of his limbs. Compensation funds were established for victims, not enough to undo the damage, but enough to pay for treatment, to ease financial burdens, to acknowledge that a wrong had been done, and that someone was being held responsible. Elena Vance was honored as the hero she had always been. The state legislature passed a resolution recognizing her courage and her sacrifice, and the EPA named a new environmental enforcement initiative after her, dedicated to protecting whistleblowers who risked their lives to expose corporate crimes. A scholarship fund was established in her name at the university, where she had earned her degree, supporting students who wanted to pursue careers in environmental science. Her photograph was displayed in the town hall, a quiet woman with kind eyes who had seen the truth and refused to look away. And beneath it was a plaque that read, "She gave her life so that others might live." Sarah received messages from across the country, emails and letters from people she had never met, thanking her for finishing what Elena had started. Some were from families in the valley who had lost loved ones to the contamination. Others were from environmentalists and activists who saw in Sarah's story a reminder that one person could make a difference. A few were from other whistleblowers, people who had seen wrongdoing and were struggling with the decision to speak out, and who found in Sarah's example the courage to act. She read every message and responded to as many as she could, humbled by the connection she felt to these strangers, by the knowledge that Elena's truth had touched lives far beyond the valley where she had died. The healing would take years, perhaps generations, but it had begun. Spring arrived in the mountains with a gentle persistence, the snow retreating day by day, revealing the dark earth beneath, and the first tentative shoots of green pushing up through the forest floor. The streams ran high and fast with snowmelt, clear and cold, carrying the promise of renewal down from the peaks to the valley below. Sarah stood on her property on a morning in late April, the sun warm on her face, the air filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the songs of birds returning from their winter migration. Before her lay the foundation of the burned cabin, a rectangle of blackened stone and charred timber that marked the place where she had nearly died, where Elena Vance's truth had nearly been destroyed forever. She had spent the winter recovering from her injuries, the frostbite that had claimed 2 of her toes, the cuts and bruises that had taken weeks to heal, the deeper wounds to her spirit that required longer still. She had stayed with Margaret in town, grateful for the old woman's kindness, and she had used the time to think about what came next, about what she wanted to build from the ashes of that terrible night. The insurance money from the cabin had come through, and the Federal Victim Compensation Fund had provided additional resources, and she had received an unexpected grant from an environmental foundation that had read Daniel's article and wanted to support her work. It was enough to rebuild, enough to start over, and as she stood looking at that scarred foundation, she knew exactly what she wanted to create. She would rebuild the cabin, not as it had been, but as something new, a structure designed for purpose as well as shelter. She would establish a small Environmental Research Station in Elena Vance's name, a place where scientists could come to study the valley's ecosystem, to monitor the recovery of the watershed, to continue the work of protecting the land and water that Elena had died for. It would be a living memorial, a way to ensure that Elena's sacrifice was not just remembered, but actively honored, her mission carried forward by new generations of researchers who would walk the same mountains and drink from the same streams and understand that this place had been saved by a woman who refused to look away from the truth. Sarah had come to these mountains with nothing, a woman who had lost her career and her home, and her sense of who she was, seeking only a quiet place to disappear while she figured out what came next. She had found something she never expected, a purpose that gave meaning to her suffering, a fight that demanded everything she had, a connection to a woman she had never met, whose courage had inspired her own. She had been tested in ways she could never have imagined, had faced down corporate killers and corrupt officials, and the brutal indifference of a mountain winter. And she had survived. More than survived, she had prevailed, and in doing so, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The valley was healing, the water running clean, the families who had suffered finally receiving justice and care. Elena Vance was at rest, her remains buried with honor, her name spoken with reverence by people who understood what she had given for them. And Sarah Mitchell, who had once defined herself by spreadsheets and financial reports, had found a new definition, a new identity built not on what she had lost, but on what she had saved. She looked at the foundation before her, at the mountains rising beyond, at the clear blue sky overhead, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. She was home, and she was ready to build.